I'm Christine Patterson from FieldPartner, and I'm a lifelong cross-cultural missions worker and trainer. And I want to invite you today to listen to this interview with Pete Askew. Pete had a stint doing overseas missions when he was a lot younger, but currently he's working full-time in a multicultural context right here in the UK. His official title is Operations Manager for the Antioch Network Manchester, an Anglican initiative which plants churches in ethnically diverse communities and on housing estates across the Diocese of Manchester. I might also add that Peter's an old friend, though we haven't actually met face to face for what, 25 years?
At least, yeah, at least.
Ross and I knew him when he was growing up in York, where his parents and we were involved in planting a church together, now known as Gateway Church in Acomb. Just to say before we begin, this interview forms part of a series of interviews filmed for the FieldPartner community. And you can find all our interviews under the interviews tab on our website. That's www.fieldpartner.org. We can see the link below. Please make sure you like our Facebook page, and on the website, subscribe to our email updates. Then you can stay current with all our news and watch new interviews as they're shared month by month. FieldPartner is an online portal of resources, training materials, courses and coaching for cross-cultural workers pre-field, on-field and post-field. You could say that's the whole life cycle of a cross-cultural worker. If you'd like to find out more about our training or coaching resources, please feel free to email me at christine@fieldpartner.org. Right, let's jump into our interview today. Thanks so much, Pete, for agreeing to be interviewed.
It's a pleasure.
Why don't you start by introducing yourself and your family?
Okay, so you've already kind of explained a little bit about how we know each other. I was, I think, 3 years old when the church was started, which you and Ross and my parents and another founding family began. So that's 1980, I think, if my maths is correct. So we've known each other for a long time, but obviously you've been in the Far East for a huge amount of time. I've lived outside of York for a long while now. I'm married to Liz, and we have got 2 kids together. We met in Leicester when she was studying law, and I was studying communications degree. And she was a first year, I was a second year. And after graduating, we moved to East Manchester, where we've lived for 20 years now. And so during that time, we've initially moved there to get involved with the Christian youth work initiative, on quite a tough housing estate. Something we can come on to perhaps in a little bit. And we've also done a ton of different paid jobs. We've helped to plant 2 churches, and we've got 2 kids now. Sam is the eldest, who's currently 11, and Ruth is 10. So a little bit about me.
Great. And so how come you landed up in Manchester in the end? Oh no, well, let's come on to that in a minute. I wanted to say, you were raised in a fairly monocultural city. And or at least it was then. I don't know if it still is. So where do you think your interest in working cross-culturally came from? And how come you landed up in Manchester in the end?
Yeah, it's really good questions. And it's a bit difficult, a bit complicated by way of answer. I'll give you a few examples. So even though York was, and to a certain extent still is, quite white British, and there's lots of people from different parts of the UK, there's not a huge amount of people from overseas. A few surprises are in there now, though. There are some Cubans, some people from Barbados, some people from Nigeria who you might not necessarily associate with York, who've settled for various reasons. But growing up in the 80s and early 90s, it was very monocultural. And there was a little kind of enclave of people from abroad, primarily connected to York University. And there were a lot of people from the Far East in particular who were doing postgrad degrees, masters and PhDs, often very, very highly specialized, very smart people. But apart from the university connection, they had no real connection with the wider community of York. And then if you throw in language barriers and other cultural things, it was quite an isolating experience for them. And I don't really know how my parents found this out, but they did. And they ended up setting up this thing called Friends of the Chinese, which was a very sort of informal association that allowed, they hosted a lot of meals, and they had music and a bit of gospel stuff as well. And I remember this guy, he was actually from Taipei, Eli, and he was not convinced about God at all. He had these questions. They did kind of alpha stuff as well when I was growing up, and he became a Christian, and his mother was furious because she was a devout Buddhist, and my parents still have on their notice board in their house a picture of his mother on her day when she was baptized as a Christian. It was a really exciting story, and so I think that's probably the first influence in terms of cross-cultural stuff. Secondly, I studied French and did some kind of social science stuff when I was studying sort of 16 to 18 years old. And when I went to university, I studied quite a lot of broad stuff. It might not sound like it hangs together in one subject, but in amongst other things, I studied Soviet propaganda, French postmodernism, and things like Noam Chomsky, his analysis of American war reporting in the Middle East and Vietnam. So this kind of really sort of broadened my kind of sense of what was going on in the world. Not that I agreed with everything that I read by any stretch. The third reason would be, in the church that you and Ross helped to plant, we had an itinerant Christian speaker who came to visit. And he had a prophecy for the young people in the church, of which I was one. And he said, loads of you are going to end up going abroad and doing some kind of mission work. And I don't believe that prophecy in the biblical sense of the phrase is like a kind of fatalistic thing. It's like a call into which you might choose to step in. You might run away like Jonah did, rather unsuccessfully. But anyway, we kind of heard that call, and my friend Steve was the first person to go from our church of that generation on a kind of short-term mission trip with YWAM, Youth with a Mission. And he loved it, and he ended up meeting the love of his life, and they married and kids in America now. Amazing story. But I think I was the second of several to go on these short-term mission trips, and they were quite life-changing. I went to South Africa age 17 for a month. I went to Northern Ireland for about a week and a half. Completely different experience in Belfast and in Cape Town. I spent a medium-term course doing a course called Discipleship Training School with YWAM in West Africa, Ghana, Togo and Benin, mostly French-speaking countries. And so that was aged about 18, and that was really life-changing. I felt less like being less a tourist and more like I was being immersed into someone else's culture. And what it did was strip off a lot of the kind of cultural baggage of what I thought was Christianity, and to see that expressed in a very different but very legitimate way. I think in particular it gave me quite an appreciation of African Christianity, but also just a bit more of awareness of other cultures and other ways of looking at the world. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, except for the bit about how you landed up in Manchester.
Oh yes, sorry, quite right. Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting in a way, because the next phase of that was when Liz and I were dating. We had to decide whether or not we were sort of compatible enough, whether we had different visions of, the future. And in the end, we both felt called to come and get involved in a very specific initiative on a housing estate, which was actually a very white British area at the time, with a thing called Eden. And so we did, and we moved, and it was quite a tough area. There was a lot of antisocial behaviour, there was a lot of crime, quite a lot of issues around drugs and so on. And there's no obvious connection with anything to do with Africa or cross-cultural stuff, except there really was a kind of, in a different way, just engaging with people who just see life very differently, even though they are also white British primarily, or white Irish, dealing with people from traveller communities from time to time, for example. And what's happened in Manchester is like London, like Birmingham and lots of other places, the world is on our doorstep now. And East Manchester, where we are, a place called Openshaw and Gorton next door, very much has become not just so much white British, but also African. And so I could experience a load of cross-cultural stuff by going back to Ghana and Benin and Togo, and that would be good and perfectly, right. But I can also just walk out my front door because it's just there. Primarily Nigerian families and people have settled where we are, and so there's a sense in which some of this has all come together. Two of my pastor friends who are local to us are from Zimbabwe and Nigeria, so there's become an increasing kind of mix across all parts of the city now, which mean that there's all sorts of opportunities for cross-cultural mission and engagement, in this country where I was born.
Right. So looking at the website for the Antioch Network, which again, I'll put the link below, it looks like quite a vibrant work. So what drew you to that in particular? I don't think that's been going very long, has it?
No, just a few years.
Mm-hmm. What do you find most exciting about being part of that?
I think in some ways it's the mixture of the two things. They have what we call a diverse side and an estate side. So having had about 20 years experience of church plant stuff on a housing estate in Manchester, two of the trustees felt I might have some useful experience to bring to the table, which is why they invited me to apply for the job as ops manager. And they were looking for someone who was more than just an administrator, but kind of what it was like to plant a church in a kind of tough urban area. And then the other side, on a diverse side, it was interesting because some of those things from my experiences when I was a bit younger and spending a bit more time abroad, it feels like that kind of has come a bit full circle for me. And it's been really interesting to see, people on that side in the diverse church plants who are from, Pakistan and India. And also there's Nepalese missionary couple who want to join one of our church plants in Rochdale. And they speak Hindi, so that opens up all sorts of opportunities for evangelism. I guess all of that's interesting to me, really, and it just felt like it was the right time when the chance came to come and work for Antioch.
Right, so it sounds like one of the values among the leadership is to have people with cross-cultural experience. Would that be true of most of them? So it's definitely an important thing, obviously, especially on the diverse side. Jason is our Gorton church planter, and he has launched a kind of, initially at least, it's a kind of house church, and that's in East Manchester. He spent about 15 years in Mauritania as a missionary, so he was working with mostly Fulani herds people, and so it's a very dangerous thing. If anyone knows anything about northern Nigeria would know that there's been a lot of violence towards Christians in northern Nigeria, sometimes by various Islamist groups, sometimes by Fulani herdsmen, and he was reaching people, so it was dangerous for them to become a Christian. It's really interesting cross-cultural work. And then Reverend John Brett, he's our diverse director. He spent about a similar amount of time in Mauritania and in Sudan, involved in missionary and NGO work. So that's definitely helps because they speak Arabic. They very aware. And interestingly, we're now in a situation in the north and east of the city where we need to look at more of a hybrid of estate and diverse, because places that were traditionally white British now have a lot of Africans, and so we're having to look at whether or not we kind of have these two prototypes of church plants, and we need to have a look at how we might do something that's sort of in the middle between the two. Right. So again, from the website, it looks like prayer is a major thing. And I've just noticed that it seems to be an unusual way round for you to be the interviewee, because it looks like you're the one who normally does the interviewing. So is that something that really underpins everything? Or is it something that the interview and the prayers online that you've been doing, is that more what you've done in response to lockdown?
Yeah, I think the answer is both. So, the kingdom advances, it's just so much of it is just through prayer. The idea of inviting somebody to come and lay down their entire life and follow somebody they can't see, it's a pretty radical call, and it's a good one, but it is a big change for people. And so, like in any context, with any ministry or church or Christian, it's a big deal. So without prayer, these things just don't happen. But in some ways, that seems even more the case when it comes to reaching people who may be from a Muslim background, for example, or maybe just lives completely messed by addiction. So we have, that's been a priority before lockdown, and it is during, and it will certainly be afterwards. However, you're absolutely right that the way that we gathered for prayer was just not possible for a huge period of time. So we'd had this discussion as a network about how we can try and facilitate prayer across the network and beyond, and to pray into these different things. And we experimented with different ideas, and we did quite a lot of a traditional Anglican liturgy, kind of night prayers thing, and we would just film somebody kind of going through the liturgy and would put it online. And that did okay for a while, and then it came a point when we were looking at other sort of online formats, and I was speaking with one of the directors, and we just felt that we needed more interaction, and the stories and people is such a powerful thing. So we kind of developed this format where we'd have 3 questions, broadly speaking, something like this: what's life like for you during lockdown? Where do you see God at work in a neighbourhood where you're doing life and ministry? And how can we pray for you and the church that you represent? So we kind of through that. We spoke with people from across different church plants, ones that haven't yet started but are planned, ones that are already in existence. And it was really just fascinating to do, and great fun. One of the best parts of the job for me so far. We even got to interview a guy whose family is heavily involved in Antioch, who's actually worked for about 6 to 9 months before starting uni on a refugee camp in a place called Moria on the Greek island of Lesbos, working with Afghans, working with people from Eritrea and all sorts. And he saw God do some amazing stuff there. So I got to interview him whilst he was in Greece, and that was just fascinating. It was really amazing just to hear what God's doing in different places. And we basically used the YouTube videos to say, look, if you're watching this, join with us in praying for this person, for the place they're working in.
Fantastic. And so during lockdown, I watched an interview that you did with Emily, young Emily, only 16. Yeah. You said she was only 16, or she's anyway still at school. But she said that she was finding it hard not to be able to do the normal outreaches during lockdown, but she was still able to smile and engage with people. And I love that as a sort of, the friendliness being the thing that draws people in. So I'm just wondering, were there other ways in which you could practically do things as a network for people who maybe had lost their jobs or other things, just to reach out during the pandemic?
Yeah, so on the point of friendliness, as definitely Emily, who I interviewed for our prayer channel, she was, I think, absolutely right. In context, there are people who are escaping. I was reading this week about, I think it's Eritrea, where there's enforced military service for men aged 18 to 50, and it can go on for years. And then there's people who just, I can't do this for any longer, so they're leaving. And some people obviously escaping a war zone, escaping some really horrendous political instability and so on. And if they end up arriving somewhere like the UK and they're welcomed by friendly Christian people in the name of Jesus, that is a wonderful opportunity for witnessing. As far as practical things, yeah, there were quite a lot of limits to what we could do and what we still can do. Greater Manchester's gone back into a more intense lockdown in the last week or so. We can't visit other households in Greater Manchester, for example. Rochdale has had quite high cases of COVID. So there have been fewer practical things we've been able to do. And with the church that I'm part of and that I lead in my spare time, we've been involved in really just kind of giving money to people where it was needed. And sometimes for food banks, people who we're connected with in some way. And what we found was the need kept rotating different places. So I think in that case, it forces you to focus on what you can do and not to stress too much on what you can't. But there were opportunities to serve people for sure. And Antioch has obviously got a bias towards the poor and people on the margins. And things like our recovery group in Bolton for people who are trying to throw off hurts, habits and hang-ups that are holding them back, that all of those moved online so that people could continue to get the support that they need if they're trying to, to stay clean of alcoholism or drug, whatever it might be. So some of that service has sort of continued. We just had to do it in a different way.
Okay, another thing I notice on the network site is the strong emphasis on training, mostly leadership training. But you personally have done some of our courses on FieldPartner. So I wondered whether that was because you also felt there might be a need for people who are involved in that kind of a community work amongst cultures, actually to do some cross-cultural training.
Yeah, definitely. And it's sort of self-evident if someone's going to get on a plane and go to another country as a missionary that they would need some cross-cultural training, some kind of orientation on arrival and prep, maybe language stuff. But this is increasingly important for people living and ministering in their own home countries, where the world is on our doorstep. I can't remember who it was. I think it was a politician got into trouble recently for saying that London's not really England. And people were sort of assuming that there was sort of casual racism, but it's sort of true. It's like the world on the doorstep. And given that that's the case in London and Manchester, Birmingham, lots of other places, even places you wouldn't expect, fishing villages that have got people from Eastern Europe and, all of that, with that being the case, that cross-cultural stuff is important here. So I actually took the Crossing Cultures 101 that you produced. Really, really good. I particularly love the point about the last culture that you really see as your own. And yeah, that really resonated with me. So I would highly recommend cross-cultural training for people who are ministering in kind of multicultural context, as well as who are going abroad, not least because we don't know what our own assumptions are. And one of my favourite guys in terms of influences is Tim Keller. And he tells this story in one of his talks that an African-American friend of his just said to him once, the problem with white people is, so it sounds a really dangerous statement. He said, well, white Christians, you don't think you have a culture. You don't think you're doing something in a white way. You just think it's the way. And it's sort of brutal, but there's probably some truth in that, those unchecked assumptions for which they need unpicking sometimes. And so some of that cross-cultural training, I would highly recommend. Anyone who's perhaps not that familiar with FieldPartner, I would highly recommend that they do some of these courses because they're really good.
Oh, thank you very much. That's great. Well, thank you, Pete, for sharing your story. It's given us a lot of food for thought, especially the challenge that for all of us, the world is on our doorstep now. And it could be as simple as just crossing the street for you to start engaging with another culture. The Bible tells us to welcome strangers in our midst. And so with people coming from all over the world right here, I think we have that challenge. And so I just want to say thanks again for the interview. And if you want to see the other interviews, do go to fieldpartner.org. Find what you can on the interviews tab. There'll be more coming out each month. And find out more about the Antioch Network too. Also like our Facebook and subscribe to our newsletters to stay up to date. But that's it for today. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next interview. Bye-bye.